Welcome to Goldfish on Games, and today I'd like to thank everyone that subscribed because we just crossed the 100 subscriber barrier. Thank you so very much for supporting me. You should all give yourself a huge round of applause for having such great taste in YouTubers. But on a more serious note, I want to talk about this game, HalfLife, because it's just passed its 20th anniversary, which just makes me feel old, but at the same time I have got such great memories of this game. I have played it to death, and rather than talk about the game itself directly like many others are, I want to talk about something else that you can find on the back of the box. Nope, not the advanced graphics engine, not the skeletal animation system. This includes a special version of WorldCraft. I swear at this point I've probably spent more time messing around in WorldCraft than I have actually playing the game, so it made sense to me to talk about the tools that made the game rather than the game itself. WorldCraft had quite the history before HalfLife even turned up. It started life as a fan editor for Quake. An earlier version of this editor is what I started messing around with back in the Quake days. I actually found it quite intuitive. It helped that it came with quite a good set of tutorials to get you going, and seemed to be quite popular with the general mapping community of the time. So when Valve were looking for an editor for their up and coming game, WorldCraft must have been very enticing, and as a result they hired Ben Morris, the sole developer of WorldCraft. Then over the next 7 months he continued to work on WorldCraft, but version 2.0, or the HalfLife version of WorldCraft. With his time at Valve over, he returned to WorldCraft version 1 and added in Quake 2 support, Hexen 2 support, as well as improving the overall feature set. Most of these updates were limited to the paid for version, and being stuck on the shareware release meant it was typically some time before I ever actually got to see these improvements, as I never really had the money to buy the editor. All my money really went on games and hardware. And amazingly, WorldCraft is still in use today, though you'll find it in its renamed and heavily updated incarnation, Hammer, or in its open source and updated version, Jack. Let's get the classic version 2.0 installed off the CD. And with that done, there's a few things that we need to set up first before we can get going, as WorldCraft 2 is still a multi-game editor, so you have to point it at the right configuration files for HalfLife, as well as which textures we want to use and the build tools. You should also point it to your copy of HalfLife and the directory that the maps are going to go into, so you can use some of the built-in features to automatically build and run the game, but we'll go into more detail on those in a little bit. So let's start a new map and get going. Now the first thing you'll notice, it uses the classic 4-view system for editing, which means we have a 3D viewport, a top-down, a side-on and a front-on view as well. This allows you to easily gauge where everything is and make sure that it's all being placed to the right size and the right height. But if you don't like this view, it's quite easy to change. Let's create a very simple level with a few rooms and something to connect them together with, and at least one enemy to fight to make it interesting. And on top of that, we'll still have to place all the boilerplate items that are required to get a working level. Let's start off by creating the 2 rooms, and we'll use 2 different methods. The first one is by taking one big block and then hollowing it. This makes it very quick and easy to create a room, but we can also place each individual wall and floor as we see fit. Though if we do that, we need to make sure we pay attention to the 3 main views to make sure everything is sized correctly. As you can see, we build levels by adding brushes to an empty world. These brushes are typically added using a predefined set of primitive shapes. This makes it quite easy and fast to build up very complex levels, but has the downside of requiring a set of tools to be run to convert it into something that the engine can actually render quite quickly. This is actually quite opposite to how the other big engine of the time, Unreal, worked, which had you carving your level out of a full world, and then only required very limited processing afterwards. And with the 2 rooms done, it's now time to place a tunnel, and this will lead us to one of the more contentious tools in the WorldCraft arsenal, carving. This allows you to make a hole in walls and floors in the shape of whatever brush you have selected at the time. Now this makes it incredibly easy to make windows and doorways and any other hole that you require. Now if you use a particularly complex shape like I've done here, it can result in some really bad looking geometry. Now there are ways of using carve in a far more efficient and sane manner, but I decided to show you what it can look like if you're not paying attention, as this can lead to all sorts of problems down the line, because it ends up generating lots of brushes, which means that there's far more polys that the game needs to render, which can really result in a performance killer. It can also lead to leaks in the level, and this is where the tools cannot work out what's inside or outside the level. And on top of all of that, it can also make resizing and retexturing a real pain, and can lead you to spend far more time trying to do those tasks than you might have saved by doing the carve in the first place. So anytime you use it, always be mindful of what sort of shape you're going to leave behind. With the basics in place, let's slap a few different textures on the walls to make it a little bit more interesting. This is easily done using the 3D view and the texture apply tool. You can change the texture of each face of a brush individually using the 3D view, or change all the faces at once using the other tool. But using the currently selected tool, we can change the angle, scale and offset of the face we're currently working on to make sure it aligns correctly with all the other faces. And already we can see the downside of doing those big carves. It takes ages to update each texture individually. Before we consider playing the map, we have a few entities that we need to place. First is where the player is going to start, and if you want the HEV suit and a weapon, you better place those at the same place as well. We should also place a few lights in the level as well, and there are a few types you can choose from. The most common are the entity based ones, where you have the general light, spotlight and environment lights. Let's place a few standard lights and an environment light where we have our sky texture. There are also textured lights, which you apply like any other texture and will emit light, but you don't have as much control over how much they emit. And finally, let's place a quick enemy, so we have something to fight against and to make the level a little bit more interesting. And with that done, it's time to save and build the level so it's playable. Building complex maps can be a very slow process, which is where having more CPU and more memory comes in handy, but this being a very simple map should be done in just a few seconds. Let's kick this process off, then explain what each of the main steps do. These consist of CSG, the Constructive Solid Geometry tool, that will take the level and break it down into polygons, and while doing so will work out what the player should collide with. Then it's the BSP, or the Binary Space Partition tool, which takes the output from CSG and creates the playable map by grouping polys into a tree so the engine has an idea of the render order. It will also calculate what is inside and outside the level. What should be next is Vise. The visibility tool is an optimization step that can detect polys that the player will never see and remove them. It will also split the level up in a way that makes it much faster to render. And finally, Rad. The radiosity tool will apply the lights that we've added to the level into a light map, which will be written to the BSP file. Vise and Rad can be skipped or reduced when doing quick iterations, but it should be run on its maximum settings from time to time so we have an idea of what the performance and the lighting is actually going to look like. These tools can also fail for a number of reasons, but the most dreaded one is a leak. This happens when there is a gap between the brushes, which means the BSP tool cannot work out what is in or outside. This can lead to all sorts of weird issues, as well as some nasty performance problems, so these should always be tracked down and fixed when they first appear. With the level built, it's time to actually test our level out in the game, and as soon as we spawn we can see that we get our HEV suit and the crowbar. And the lighting, it seems a little rough, but we only placed a few entities in, so that was to be expected. But we can move around the level quite easily, and it doesn't take long before we're face to face with the Hound Eye. Now, funnily enough, the first time I played the game I actually assumed these things were passive, as they looked far too cute to be aggressive. Boy, that did not last long, and now that charge sound is burnt into my soul. There is so much more in this editor that I could show you, such as adding ladders, more complex enemy types, traps, even scripted events, but the video would end up so long that I doubt anyone could make it to the end. And so if you are interested in these more complex topics, please look around because there's loads of very great tutorials online, both in YouTube videos and on the web, and also built into Hammer and WorldCraft themselves. There was a very vibrant third-party tools community that spawned out of Half-Life and resulted in some great tools, such as ones that made it easier to create new texture WADs so you could get custom textures into your level, or ones that allowed you to generate more complex looking terrains to make your levels look better. But one of the bigger sets of tools was the Zonar's build tools. These were a complete replacement for the build tools I've mentioned before. They all did the exact same thing, but they usually did it in a much better way, or in a much faster way. This included more detailed lighting, better error messages, or even a set of tools to help the Vize process, either by marking faces that should never be visible, or giving it hints of where it should be trying to split the level. So if you are interested in creating new maps for Half-Life, you really should check these out, as they will help you immensely. Now, it was quite a few years since I last booted up WorldCraft and messed around with it, so it was a bit of a homecoming for me, because I'd spent so much time in it over the years, that this video was threatening to be hours and hours long of me trying to create a brand new level and take on a brand new project. So I feel this is probably the best place to leave this for now, and hopefully I've whet your appetite for making levels for Half-Life. And so until next time, I've been the Goldfish, that was WorldCraft, the editor that made Half-Life, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching me get all nostalgic over a level editor. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, because I tend to put out 2 videos a month that range from topics like this to old hardware or games.